More than 90 years ago, on March 22, 1933, the Nazi regime erected one of its first and most abominable extermination centers, the Dachau concentration camp. More than just a prison, it became a grim model for the future machinery of death. Here, the infamous motto Arbeit macht frei, which means work sets you free, ironically greeted prisoners at the entrance. Created just weeks after Adolf Hitler assumed the office of Chancellor, this place of horror was located on the outskirts of the town of Dachau, just 12 miles north of the gleaming Munich, a strategic area for the Nazis. In addition to mass killings, the camp was a grim setting for medical experiments, forced labor, systematic rape, physical and psychological torture, and above all, hunger. Though spanning large kilometers and diverse terrains, the expanses of this hellish place were simply known as Dachau, a name that would resonate in history as a symbol of human cruelty. Join us in this new installment of Military History to explore the most horrifying details of the first model of Nazi extermination camps. Let's begin. Located on the grounds of a decommissioned ammunition factory near the northeast edge of Dachau, approximately 12 miles northwest of Munich in southern Germany, the camp received its first prisoner transport on March 22, 1933. It initially served as an internment site for opponents of the Nazi regime, primarily communists, social democrats, and trade unionists. Heinrich Himmler, then head of the Munich police and later second in command of the Nazi hierarchy, officially christened it as the first concentration camp for political prisoners, which he claimed would restore calm in Germany. However, over time, the camp's population diversified to include Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexual men, and individuals categorized as asocial. Originally designed to hold 5,000 prisoners, by the end of the war, overcrowding exceeded its initial capacity by 195,000. In October 1933, under the leadership of Theodor Eicke, the camp adopted a draconian system of regulations, subjecting prisoners to brutal punishments. Eicke's subsequent role as inspector ensured that Dachau served as a model for later camps, also becoming a training center for SS guards deployed throughout the camp network. In early 1937, the SS began construction of an expansive complex of buildings on the original campgrounds. This arduous task began with the demolition of the old ammunition factory, carried out by prisoners in deplorable conditions. Although a gas chamber was built at Dachau alongside the crematorium, it was never used for mass murder. Mass killings occurred through shootings, hangings, and primarily through a gradual and brutal process of starvation, forced labor, and exposure to cold. The latter was carried out by forcing prisoners to remain outdoors for hours in extreme conditions, without adequate clothing or food. It is also known that some prisoners were sprayed with icy water and left outside to freeze. The victims were not limited to political prisoners. Regarding the victims of the final solution, the number of Jewish prisoners in Dachau increased as their persecution intensified. The images we just saw reflect the violent attacks suffered by Jews. The genocide began with Kristallnacht, also known as the Night of Broken Glass. It was a coordinated series of attacks against Jews in Nazi Germany and Austria on November 9 to 10, 1938. During that night, synagogues were set on fire, many businesses were destroyed, and innocent homes were vandalized. Thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps. It is estimated that at least 91 of them were killed in these attacks, though the actual number could be much higher. However, the most terrible events were yet to come. On November 20th of the same year, just 10 days after Kristallnacht, almost 11,000 Jewish men were interned in Dachau. After the SS received the assignment to complement the police overseeing Dachau camp, the first reports of prisoner deaths emerged in April 1933. Josef Hartinger, an official from the Bavarian Ministry of Justice, and Dr. Moritz Flamm arrived at the camp to investigate these deaths under Bavarian criminal law. Over several months, they noted many inconsistencies between the wounds on the bodies and the accounts provided by the camp guards. They uncovered clear evidence of murder and compiled charges against Hilmar Weckerle, the SS commander of Dachau, Werner Nürnberg, the camp doctor, and Josef Mutzbauer, the camp's chief administrator. In June 1933, Hartinger presented the case to his superior, Bavarian state prosecutor Karl Wintersberger, who initially supported the investigation but became reluctant to submit the resulting charges to the Ministry of Justice under increasing SS influence. Hartinger narrowed the scope of the case to the 4 clearest instances, which Wintersberger signed off on after notifying Himmler as a courtesy. The killings at Dachau abruptly and temporarily ceased. Weckerle was transferred to Stuttgart and replaced by Theodor Eicke. The center was divided into 2 sections, the camp area and the crematorium area. The camp area consisted of 32 barracks, including one for clergy imprisoned for opposing the Nazi regime and another reserved for medical experiments. The administration was located in the main entrance building. The inhabited zone included a set of support buildings housing the kitchen, laundry, showers, workshops, and a cell block. The courtyard between the prison and the central kitchen was used for summary executions of prisoners. The camp was surrounded by electrified barbed wire, a moat, and a wall with 7 watchtowers. In 1942, the crematorium area was built adjacent to the main camp. When the Allies liberated Dachau, there were still corpses, as you are about to see, completely incinerated in this grim section. This zone included the old crematorium and the new incineration center with a gas chamber. However, instead of being used for gassing, prisoners underwent a selection. Those judged too sick or weak to continue working were sent to the euthanasia center at Hartheim Castle near Linz, Austria. There, over 2,500 prisoners transferred from Dachau were killed in gas chambers. Additionally, mass executions were carried out by shooting, first in the bunker courtyard and later in an SS-designed shooting range. In 1943, 123 subcamps were established in the Dachau system, exploiting forced labor from prisoners for the construction of factories near the main camp. 11 of these subcamps, named Kaufering, were distinguished by a number at the end of each name. Each had a specific purpose: to build 3 underground factories as part of Project Ringeltaube, aimed at producing the German fighter aircraft Messerschmitt Me 262. During the final days of the war in April 1945, the Kaufering camps were evacuated, and approximately 15,000 prisoners were transferred to the main Dachau camp. It is important to clarify that forced labor of prisoners was one purpose of the subcamps, but not the only one. As noted earlier, this center of horror also became a gruesome laboratory, where Nazi doctors and scientists conducted brutal experiments on prisoners, using their lives as currency for their sadistic research. Genia Obuff was one of the survivors who could testify to these practices.
Nunca había visto un aparato de rayos X. Tenía buena salud. Nunca había visto esas cosas. Recuerdo muy bien cómo era. Era un aparato de rayos X muy grande, con 2 bastidores. Te ponías entre esos 2 bastidores y con una plancha de madera delante y otra detrás.
Since 1942, these men in white coats embarked on a series of unprecedented medical atrocities. One of the horrors carried out was the study of hypothermia and altitude. Prisoners were subjected to extreme cold and high altitudes to simulate conditions that pilots might face in aerial combat. Their endurance was pushed to the limit, resulting in the death of many due to freezing and lack of oxygen. The Nazis also sought ways to convert seawater into a survival source for pilots forced to land in the ocean. Prisoners were forced to drink seawater and ingest various substances in a macabre attempt to purify saltwater. The results were disastrous. Many suffered severe, slow, and painful illnesses that led to death from forced ingestion of toxic substances. Additionally, Nazi doctors studied the effects of freezing on warm-blooded animals and infected Jews with malaria. The original records of these experiments were destroyed by the Nazis to conceal their atrocities. Our knowledge of what occurred comes from the survivors.
Estabas desnuda de cintura para abajo. Tenías que estar callada, no podías gritar.
Also, various drugs were administered to the inmates to study their effects. However, the lack of rigor and the delusions of this pseudoscience led most to death. Apart from the experiments, another macabre specialty at Dachau were the priests' barracks, or Priesterblock in German. In 1940, the Nazis abducted clergy from various denominations across Germany and from other camps in over 20 Nazi-occupied countries. Most were Catholic priests, many from Poland, who had vehemently opposed the Nazi regime and denounced the atrocities committed. In total, around 3,000 clergymen suffered at Dachau. During that dark period, these priests faced a series of challenges, from ideological persecution to brutal living conditions in the camp. However, their resilience and solidarity were further tested when a typhus epidemic broke out in the camp in early 1945. Faced with a desperate need for medical attention, some brave priests volunteered to care for the sick. Overcrowding, lack of personal hygiene, and food shortages contributed to the rapid contagion and spread of typhus. Even after American soldiers liberated the camp, it remained sealed for weeks under strict quarantine due to the outbreak. The devastating epidemic claimed over 10,000 lives, including several hundred Catholic priests who had remained in Dachau until the end. These men of faith, who had dedicated their lives to serving others, succumbed to a terrible disease amid anguish and widespread suffering. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor from the beginning of their internment, Initially, they were forced to work in the daily operation of the camp in various construction projects and in small artisan industries established within the camp itself. Under the whip of Nazi cruelty, these men were compelled to build roads, excavate quarries, and drain swamps under inhuman conditions. What you are about to see are some of the Jews of Dachau in a normal day of exhausting work. As the war progressed, the use of concentration camp prisoners became crucial for German armaments production. In an effort to increase war production, satellite camps under Dachau administration were established near armaments factories in southern Germany in the summer and fall of 1944. Thousands of prisoners were subjected to grueling work, without adequate rest or sufficient food, under constant surveillance and the whip of the guards. Testimonies describe heartbreaking scenes of prisoners collapsing at work, their exhausted bodies falling to the ground while the air was filled with the lament of despair. For many, death became a release from their agony, a final escape from an existence marked by brutality and suffering. The admission, registration, and interrogation of detainees were steeped in derogatory comments from SS officials. Prisoners were trampled on and beaten during roll call. Forced labor included useless and arduous tasks designed to exhaust prisoners physically and mentally. During these grueling days, there was no possible identity. This is testified by an Italian survivor.
Tu qui sei un numero, non hai nessun diritto, solo doveri. Ricordati che sei un numero. Le parole che si hanno detto appena arrivati dentro il campo.
The prisoners' area was highly protected to prevent escapes. A 3-meter-wide no man's land was the first marker of confinement for the prisoners. Entering this zone triggered deadly shots from the watchtowers. Guards would throw prisoners' caps into this area, resulting in the death of those who attempted to retrieve them. The most desperate prisoners witnessing this cruelty exploited the Germans' actions and entered the area to quickly end a life that they felt was no longer worth living. In August 1944, a women's camp was opened within Dachau. The female prisoners, many transferred from the Ravensbrück women's camp, faced constant threats of physical and sexual abuse from guards and other camp officials. The arbitrary power over their lives left them vulnerable to exploitation and mistreatment. This situation worsened during the final months of the war, as conditions in the camp deteriorated drastically. As the Allied forces advanced towards Germany, the Germans began transferring prisoners closer to the front, to camps in more strategic locations, hoping to avoid their mass liberation. Amidst this chaos and desperation, the women in Dachau faced increased violence and oppression from their captors, who became even more brutal in their attempts to maintain control over the prisoners. Transports from evacuated camps continually arrived at Dachau. After days of travel with little or no food or water, prisoners arrived weak and exhausted, often on the brink of death. Due to repeated transfers from the front, the camp was constantly overcrowded and hygiene conditions were inhumane. From late 1944 until the day of liberation, 15,000 people died, about half of all prisoners held in Dachau. Among them, 500 Soviet prisoners of war were executed by shooting. This final period in Dachau was marked by indescribable anguish. Desperation and hopelessness filled the air, while death and agony were constant companions for those trapped in the horror of Dachau. The lack of food, water, and adequate medical attention exacerbated the suffering, while diseases and arbitrary violence claimed lives at an alarming rate. Many parents had to make the heartbreaking decision to sacrifice their food rations to feed their children.
Come posso dimenticare il fatto che mio padre si levava il pezzetto di pane per me? È una cosa che è inimmaginabile oggigiorno.
The death march from the Dachau concentration camp was a harrowing odyssey that reflected the cruelty and desperation of the Nazi regime in its final days. On April 24, 1945, as American troops approached the camp, the commander and a detachment of guards forced between 6,000 and 7,000 prisoners, already weakened by years of brutality and extreme deprivation, to embark on a 6-day march southwards towards Eurasburg and then eastwards towards Tegernsee. The march was an unimaginable test of physical and mental endurance. The prisoners were barefoot, in tattered clothes, and received barely any food or water. Every step was agony, and those who couldn't keep up were cruelly executed by the guards. Many others succumbed to exhaustion, collapsing to the ground and being trampled by those behind them, or simply left behind to die. Lifeless bodies piled up along the route, a grim trail of death accompanying the survivors on their march into the unknown. Months later, on April 29, 1945, when American Allied forces liberated the region, a mass grave was discovered along the march route containing the remains of 1,071 prisoners. By the end of the war, the mortality rate had peaked at 200 deaths per day. But after this event, it eventually dropped to between 50 and 80 deaths per day due to malnutrition and diseases. As mentioned, besides direct SS abuse and harsh conditions, epidemics of typhus and famine were brutal. With evacuations from eastern camps like Auschwitz, the number of prisoners at Dachau had steadily increased, leading to overcrowding and a rising death rate. Inside the camp, the Allies found even more corpses, often naked, lying where they had fallen in the hours or days before the camp's liberation. Sometimes the bodies were stacked on top of each other like firewood. For many soldiers, witnessing these atrocities gave new meaning to the war. They realized they were not just fighting an enemy, but pure evil. The Nazis tried to incinerate as many bodies as they could before abandoning the extermination center, but there were too many. The arrival of Americans and Soviets triggered an episode of brutality. Traumatized by the sight of emaciated bodies and the inhuman living conditions of the prisoners, they carried out cold-blooded executions of several hundred Nazis who had not fled. Reports vary on the number of victims. Some speculate that over 100 German soldiers died, while others report that 30-50 soldiers were killed during the capture of the camp. This event on April 29, 1945 is known as the Dachau Massacre. This place symbolized a model of extermination for the industrialization of death on unimaginable scales, which by the end of the war numbered in the millions. Today, the facilities of the complex function as a memorial museum. Between 1996 and 2003, a new exhibition was developed at the museum offering a comprehensive view of the history, focusing on the Dachau camp under the main theme, The Path of the Prisoners. The Memorial Center features 22 distinct areas, of which 21 are open to the public for visitation. The only area closed to the public is the SS camp. History has taught us that the Auschwitz concentration camp was a true hell. But if you were a woman, you had a date with the devil himself. From beginning to end, women were victims of the most horrifying acts of the Nazi regime. Beatings, rapes, forced prostitution, and the cruelest and most inhuman experiments. Those who arrived at the camp pregnant were forced to abort in the worst ways you can imagine, and if that weren't enough, they then tested brutal sterilization methods on them.
Nos decían, van a hacer todo tipo de experimentos con ustedes. Y el objetivo de todo eso es que nunca tengan hijos.
Most of them didn't live to tell the tale. Meanwhile, those who managed to overcome hunger, pain, and agony claim that a part of their being also died in Auschwitz. In this new video from Military History, we will learn about the torment of the women who ended up in one of the most terrifying concentration camps of World War II. Get ready to learn about one of the cruelest episodes of humanity.
No sabíamos dónde estábamos ni lo que nos estaba pasando. Cuando llegamos nos sorprendió el hedor bestial, terrible que había. Y ni un árbol, ni un pájaro. Un silencio absoluto.
Adolf Hitler built Nazi ideology on a profound racial basis. According to his view, all groups or peoples possessed inherent and immutable traits that were passed down from generation to generation. No individual could surpass the innate qualities of their race. For the Führer, these inherited characteristics were not only related to external appearance and physical structure, but also influenced modes of thinking, creative abilities, intelligence, cultural appreciation, physical strength, and military skill. Under these ideas, Jews were assigned a wide range of negative stereotypes and were considered a major threat. To maintain the purity of the German genetic heritage, the best option they found was to imprison and annihilate their principal enemy.
Luego nos pusieron un número en el brazo. A partir de ese momento, éramos solo un número. Después, llegamos al pabellón de los experimentos.
While the Nazis promoted reproduction among their people, they planned the total extermination of Jews in Europe. No distinction was made by sex or age, even children fell victim to the brutal Holocaust. However, the Third Reich frequently subjected women to cruel persecution solely because of their gender. In fact, certain spaces were specifically designated for female prisoners. Not only Jews, but also Romani, Polish, and additionally, individuals with disabilities. In May 1939, the SS opened Ravensbrück, the largest Nazi concentration camp established for women. It was discovered that over 100,000 girls had been imprisoned there when Soviet troops liberated the site 6 years after it began operating.
They made us stand for 24 hours in the square before sending us to the showers. There, we had to undress fully and wait for the Germans.
In 1942, a special complex for women was also established in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it is here that we will focus to understand the greatest atrocities suffered by the victims detained in this notorious internment site. Some of the punishments inflicted were common to all the camps erected during World War II, such as euthanasia programs. This was part of the Nazi policy known by the code name Final Solution, which included mass shootings and the creation of gas chambers. This initiative, known as T4, was used in Auschwitz to mass murder Romani women and women with disabilities. However, it was only one of the terrible ways in which people could lose their lives. The German authorities sent prisoners to perform forced labor, under conditions that often led to their deaths. They were also particularly vulnerable to beatings and rape. In many cases, they were forced to have sexual relations to obtain food or satisfy basic needs. This occasionally led to pregnancies by Nazi men, and if the so-called racial experts determined that the child would not be able to Germanize, the mother was forced to abort in an environment where both her life and the baby's had a virtually guaranteed fatal outcome.
SS commanders of the concentration camps had a keen eye on the populations and wanted a clock-like scientific sweeping control of them. This included ordering any pregnancies to be reported and for the women to receive abortions. Tragically, such force upon reproductive rights produced drastic measures. The pregnant women of concentration camps had two options. They could face the abortion the Nazis forced upon them, or they could hope to acquire an abortion secretly through fellow inmates. These latter abortions were an effort and hope to save the life of the mother.
The idea of concealing abortions was part of the mutual assistance practiced by imprisoned women, who formed groups with the goal of helping each other survive by sharing information, food, and clothing. Often, they came from the same city or province, had similar levels and styles of education, or shared family connections. Even so, unless one of the individuals involved was a health professional who was also imprisoned, the risk of death from such procedures was no less. You might wonder, why didn't they wait for German medical attention in these cases? The answer is as cruel as the entire experience in the concentration camp. Auschwitz had the involvement of a large number of renowned medical professionals, though they carried out the lethal brutality of the Nazi regime. In fact, their involvement may have been directly related to some of the most atrocious crimes committed within the camps where prisoners were held. Women in these places were subjected to a vast array of completely inhumane experiments. Driven by the Nazi program, it didn't matter if the victims ended up dying or the suffering they endured along the way. Ruthless individuals conducted all sorts of acts, justifying them as tests to learn how to treat certain diseases or to gather data on human tolerance under various circumstances. Thus, some people were frozen to death by exposure to excessively cold temperatures. Others were inflicted with severe wounds that were then infected to observe how the body responded. After painful and exhausting examinations that lasted hours, many were often given a direct injection of phenol into the heart, which caused death to allow for an autopsy and further results to support the research. The possibilities for experimenting at the expense of others' suffering knew no bounds, extending as far as the imagination of the perverse SS and Wehrmacht doctors.
One of the most vicious experiments was the transplantation of limbs. The process consisted of amputating legs or arms, which were transplanted to other test subjects. Anesthesia was practically never used, so the unfortunate women experienced absolutely inhuman suffering. At the end of the experiments, they were given lethal injections and their bodies were burned.
Among those responsible for the horrifying experiments, there is probably no name more infamous than Dr. Joseph Mengele. He was interested in genetic issues and sought to study specific groups, such as dwarfs and particularly twins. In the initial phase of his experiments, he subjected pairs of twins and people with physical disabilities to special medical examinations that could be performed on living organisms. These procedures were generally very painful and became a harrowing experience for the hungry and terrified children. The victims were photographed, Plaster molds were made of their teeth and jaws, and their fingerprints and footprints were taken. As soon as he finished with these procedures on a pair of siblings or dwarfs, Mengele ordered their execution so he could proceed to the next stage of his experiments: the comparative analysis of internal organs during autopsy. Anatomical samples of pseudoscientific interest were preserved and sent to the Berlin Dahlem Institute for more detailed examination. However, these cruel experiments never yielded results of real scientific value. A particular case associated with the work of this Nazi figure was that of Ruth Elias. She was a young woman who was pregnant when she was transferred from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz.
Nazi medical experiments on pregnant camp inmates centered on studying the effects of starvation and malnutrition on pregnancy. In predominance, such experiments cost the lives of both the fetus and the mother. While the percentage of women who gave birth at Auschwitz was small, the majority would not survive, mostly ending in stillbirth or miscarriage. Without a doubt, the most traumatizing possible outcome was if the baby survived childbirth.
Ruth Elias survived the harsh conditions she faced, but something worse was about to happen. After she gave birth, the SS doctor ordered that her breasts be bound with a rope as part of an experiment to see how long her newborn daughter could survive without food. Although Ruth secretly fed the baby by soaking pieces of bread in water, the infant weakened and her stomach became distended from hunger. After seeing her suffer for several days, a Czech female doctor who was also imprisoned with Ruth convinced her to inject her daughter with a lethal dose of morphine, as she would not survive, thus ending her agony. Research on the effects of hunger on the human body continued under Dr. Johann Paul Kremer. He focused particularly on the liver and how it atrophied. After pushing his victims to the brink of death by starvation, he ordered them to be injected with phenol. At this point, it is necessary to review some key points. Hitler aimed for the Aryan race, which he associated with Germans, to endure while exterminating the Jews. Therefore, pregnancies among women of his racial enemy were a significant problem addressed with abortion. However, Auschwitz became a place where experiments were conducted to end this issue definitively through sterilization. The person in charge of this work was Dr. Klauberg.
Un buen día hubo una llamada especial. Klauberg en persona eligió a varias de nosotras. Formábamos filas de A5 y seleccionó a quien quiso. No daba miedo. Era pequeño, gordo, con sombrero tirolés, pantalón bávaro, medias blancas, grandes botas de montaña. No se correspondía con la imagen de las SS que una pueda tener.
But appearances can be deceiving. Karl Klauberg was a German who served as an infantry soldier during World War I. After that conflict, he studied medicine and eventually reached the rank of chief physician at the University Gynecological Clinic. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party while being appointed associate professor of gynecology at the University of Königsberg. During his career, he conducted research on female fertility hormones and their applications. This allowed him to meet important SS members, as he was responsible for treating the wife of a high-ranking official. In 1942, he contacted the leader of the organization, Heinrich Himmler, and requested the opportunity to conduct mass sterilizations for his experiments. After receiving approval, he began his experiments in December of that year at the Block 10 laboratory in Auschwitz. His goal was to find an easy and inexpensive method for sterilizing women. In 2 large rooms on the 2nd floor of the building, several hundred Jewish women from various countries lived. Klauberg developed a non-surgical method involving the introduction of a specially prepared chemical irritant into the female reproductive organs which caused severe inflammation. The formaldehyde preparation intended for the uteruses of his test subjects was applied without anesthesia, causing immense suffering, permanent damage, and severe infections. After several weeks, the fallopian tubes would close and block forever.
La función del bloque 10 era llevar a cabo un segundo genocidio. En otras palabras, matar a personas que aún no habían nacido para que ya no hubiera razas indeseables.
Klauberg's experiments killed some of the women he used as test subjects, while others were intentionally executed to perform autopsies and compare results. The killings were cold and conducted under the guise of supposed science, though they were as violent and cruel as those on the battlefield. Beyond those who died, it is estimated that around 700 women were sterilized with this brutal and painful method. Himmler wanted to know how long it would take to perform this procedure on 1,000 Jewish women, and the doctor's response was satisfactory regarding the request. In June 1943, during the final phase of the experiment, he wrote a letter to the SS leader in which he stated, "The non-surgical method for sterilizing women that I have invented is now nearly perfected. If the research I am conducting continues to produce the results it has so far, then an experienced doctor with a properly equipped clinic and the assistance of 10 auxiliary personnel will be able to carry out the sterilization of hundreds or even 1,000 women within a single day." The Nazi authorities were more than satisfied with the conclusions of the experiment, but the feelings were completely opposite for the victims who endured it.
Nos llamaban por nuestro número y luego Klauberg u otro tipo nos inyectaba algo en la vagina. Y después nos decía, ya no habrá más niños.
As if that weren't enough, Karl Klauberg was not the only doctor whose perverse actions condemned thousands of women in Block 10 to suffering. He was not alone, and like him, Dr. Horst Schumann sought a convenient method of mass sterilization that would enable the Third Reich to carry out the biological destruction of the conquered nations. This figure had his own method for depriving people of their reproductive capacity, and as in other cases, it was accompanied by torture and pain for Jews and other prisoners. A special team was set up for Schumann in one of the Auschwitz barracks, and from time to time, several dozen victims were brought in for him to experiment on. The sterilization experiments involved exposing the women's ovaries to X-rays. The doctor applied various intensities at different intervals in search of the optimal dose of radiation. However, the exposure caused severe burns on the subjects' abdomens, groins, and buttocks, and suppurating sores that were resistant to healing. A survivor of those dark days in the concentration camp recalls the horror she could see around her during the gruesome tests.
Con las primeras que recibieron rayos X fue muy rápido. Yo fui la segunda y pasó muy deprisa. Luego les tocó a otras y cada vez las exponían más y más. Yo apenas noté nada. Me dejó una manchita roja, pero nada malo. La primera no tenía ni eso, pero en la tercera la mancha ya era más pronunciada y en la cuarta aún más, y las últimas se retorcían de dolor, se sentían mal y tenían que vomitar.
Many of the women died from complications resulting from radiation exposure, and it was concluded that the results of the X-ray sterilization experiments were not satisfactory. In fact, in an article sent by Schumann to Heinrich Himmler in April 1944, he expressed a preference for surgical castration, as it was quicker and more reliable. This meant that Dr. Klauberg was the only one who had a relatively successful outcome in his research, although this did not make him any less perverse than the others. In fact, the day would eventually come when he had to answer for his cruel acts. At the end of 1944, as the Red Army approached the Auschwitz camp, the doctor moved to the Ravensbrück concentration camp to continue his experiments with Romani women. However, Soviet troops captured him there in 1945. After the war, Klauberg was tried in the Soviet Union and sentenced to 25 years in prison. But in 1955, he was released under a prisoner exchange agreement. That same year, he returned to West Germany, where he was reinstated at his former clinic with the aim of continuing his scientific work from before the conflict. The Nazi seemed to have escaped blame and responsibility, but his ego led to his downfall. He behaved oddly, openly boasting about his supposed achievements in developing a new sterilization technique at the Auschwitz concentration camp. This destroyed any chance of remaining unnoticed, and just a few months after his return to German soil, public protests from survivor groups led to Klauberg's arrest. Ultimately, the doctor died on August 9, 1957, before his trial. He spent his final days in the city of Kiel, Germany, where he suffered a heart attack at the age of 58. Nevertheless, he left behind a legacy of horror that continued to haunt his victims for a long time.
Nos decían, van a hacer todo tipo de experimentos con ustedes. Y el objetivo de todo eso es que nunca tengan hijos. Y desde luego se puede decir que lo consiguieron.
Forever marked by the brutal and cruel experiments conducted at Auschwitz, these women continued with their lives. Many were unable to speak about their suffering due to shame, and it took decades before they were able to share their stories. On that long path of suffering, the vast majority of them were never able to have children. That was the cost of surviving the darkest chapter known to humanity. Concentration camps were one of the most brutal and bloodthirsty tools used by the Nazis during World War II. These spaces received thousands of prisoners who were subjected to the most incredible atrocities in history, places where there was no mercy and death was common. Hunger and pain were present daily to such an extent that suffering became the most loyal companion of the people confined in the different camps throughout Germany and the lands under its control. However, there was one that was special. We are talking about Ravensbrück, the only one exclusively for women, and which had the particularity of not being occupied mainly by Jews, but was the final destination of the political prisoners of the Third Reich. In this new military history video, we will learn what life was like in this ruthless Nazi camp. Stay with us to find out.
We saw some very thin women file past, dragging themselves along with shovels on their backs. It was a terrible shock because they were in such a state. It made you wonder, who on earth are these women? Where are we? You never imagined you would become the same.
These women must have done some appalling things to be treated in such a way. They looked awful to us. Some of them, who were French, called to us, "You'll soon look like us."
Contrary to popular belief, the history of Nazi concentration camps began long before World War II. The economic depression of 1929 destabilized the Weimar Republic, and while the collapse of the regime that governed Germany began, the figure of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist Party grew. Finally, in 1933, the Führer came to power, and with him came several practices designed to have absolute control of the country. Among them, the existence of confinement spaces where tens of thousands of opponents of the ideology of the new leader were taken prisoner. Any pretext was good to stop the different groups, since, although they were mostly members of the German Communist Party, there were also criminals, asocials, and Jews. It is presumed that the first concentration camp was established in the city of Nora on March 3, 1933, in the facilities of a school. But they soon multiplied throughout the country, always under the command of the SS, the paramilitary organization at Hitler's service, which was commanded by one of the people he trusted the most, Heinrich Himmler. The legal basis for the arrests was the practice called protective custody, which meant restricting a person's freedom for their own protection or during an emergency. With this policy, the number of prisoners increased rapidly, and new camps were born to hold them. By the end of the first year in which they operated, 80% of the inmates were communists, 10% were social democrats, and the remaining 10% were affiliated with other parties, were union activists, or had no connection to a political space. However, at that time one could see a peculiarity in the large group that was captured and repressed in an attempt to bring it closer to Nazi ideology. They were all men.
Himmler was convinced that by assembling these prisoners in the regenerative forests of the Reich, the Aryan race would be purified. Up until 1937, women had been less targeted by his policy.
We're dealing with a society that imagines itself as virile, and so there's a very strong idea that women don't think, and therefore do not represent any political danger, which explains why between 33 and 37, the Nazis didn't do anything much against women.
But from 1937 on, the wind changed.
With a new approach, where the female gender had achieved greater participation in society, the concentration camps began to show a growth in the number of female prisoners, and that led to the idea of an exclusive space for them. At the beginning of 1938, Himmler began planning a camp for women considered deviant. This classification included prostitutes, abortionists, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and of course, communists and Jews. For this purpose, he chose a place near the town of Ravensbrück in the picturesque Mecklenburg Lake District, an hour from Berlin, where one of his best friends from the SS had a rest home. The works for the construction of the new confinement site were carried out by male prisoners who were sent from another camp, Sachsenhausen. They worked tirelessly, in the worst conditions, and brutally subjected by the Nazi forces to finish the job as soon as possible. Many of them died of hunger and exhaustion while carrying out this task, but the SS members did not care. The most important thing for them was that by the first months of 1939, they had already set up their camp in Ravensbrück, and on May 15th of that year, the first 867 women arrived there. It is true that the violent war had not yet begun, but the apparatus set up by the Führer already had a large network prepared for what was to come.
May 1939, Germany. The Second World War had not yet broken out. Nonetheless, the Third Reich was rolling out a huge secret operation across the whole German territory. Hitler's trains and trucks crossed the country, loaded with prisoners who were political opponents or Germans and Austrians deemed unworthy of the Aryan race.
With the arrival of the battle, the number of enemies of the Nazis increased. Now it was not only limited to rivals of their ideology on German soil, but to opponents throughout Europe. In addition, Jews were one of the main targets of Hitler as a threat to his defense of the race, so they quickly became the majority within the groups of prisoners in the concentration camps. However, Ravensbrück was different. That space, which had as its first commander the SS Colonel Günther Tomaszka, had a very marked peculiarity determined by the gender of the inmates. They were all women. But in addition, the origin of the prisoners detained there also broke with the normality of the other camps. The largest group consisted of 40,000 Polish women, and another important group included 27,000 Jews from various countries, about 18,000 Russians, 8,000 French, and 1,000 Dutch. However, despite these figures, more than 80% of the prisoners in this camp were political prisoners. Continuing with the number of people who were taken to Ravensbrück, we get closer to what the living conditions were like in this camp, since Himmler had been warned from the beginning that it could hold a maximum of 50,000 inmates. However, despite knowing this figure, the place ended up grotesquely overcrowded by the more than 130,000 prisoners who ended up locked up there. Although the Nazis worked to enlarge the place and equip it with new and fearsome spaces, the occupants of the camp could not escape the overcrowding.
The brand new camp at the time comprised 16 dormitory shacks, 2 workshop blocks, the Kommandantur guard quarters, showers, kitchens, and the infirmary called the Revier. The 9 square kilometer site was ringed by a wall 4 meters high, topped with electrified barbed wire. As the roundups continued, the number of dormitory blocks doubled to 32. The Nazis also built a bunker containing 80 cells, 1 gas chamber, and a building to house 3 crematorium ovens.
Equipped in this way, Ravensbrück functioned in a similar way to most large Nazi concentration camps, and daily life there was extremely harsh. The meager food and inadequate housing reached unbearable levels with the constant influx of prisoners. In addition, this camp was also a place of work, and all inmates who were healthy enough to perform any kind of work were forced to spend 12 hours a day carrying out physically demanding tasks. Many of them even performed duties in a factory run by Siemens, to which they were taken during the day. In addition, routine selections were made to eliminate those women who were not fit for these exhausting jobs. Despite these strict characteristics, the tens of thousands of people interned at Ravensbrück managed to establish support networks over the years. They secretly took part in religious services, took part in many cultural productions, committed acts of sabotage in factories, and worked to save the lives of their sick comrades. This was largely achieved thanks to the progress of the war. In the first months of the camp's existence, when the prison population was still quite small, it became relatively easy for the SS to maintain strict control over the prisoners' daily lives. At that time, it was difficult even to meet up with other inmates during the few free hours. Occasionally, some women managed to escape despite the great risk to which they were exposed, and recited poetry, discussed politics, or sang in small groups somewhere far from the blocks of rooms. However, once the war began, even though daily life worsened in terms of food and living conditions, the SS also reduced the level of control. It was more difficult to keep track of the movement of all the prisoners, and this reduced the punishment for relatively minor infractions, such as not carrying out an order exactly as the soldiers intended. The high number of German-speaking women in the camp also facilitated the development of cultural activities, since the guards, who were mostly female, tended to be more lenient with them. At this time, it was almost a blessing not to be Jewish, since with the war in full swing, treatment of that particular group became harsher.
Political prisoner was much better. Mind you, many of them were killed or died just the same, but not as automatically as when you were Jewish. There was no question about not being sent to Auschwitz.
It is true that Ravensbrück had many artists and intellectuals among its population. Particularly notable were the large number of educated Polish women sent there, as well as groups of Czech students. Cultural activity among women usually began in the initial quarantine phase, when the new arrivals were not allowed to leave their precarious dormitories for several weeks. Many composed poems, which they memorized in their heads and recorded on scraps of paper. Others managed to put together leaflets containing songs and drawings by the inmates, and there was even music composition. However, these small glimpses of humanity that characterized this particular Nazi camp were only momentary. As in the rest of the spaces prepared for prisoners of the German forces, there was always the time for atrocities. The female exclusivity opened the possibility for different things within Ravensbrück, such as setting up the main training camp for female SS guards. From there emerged some of the most infamous and brutal figures of the Third Reich, such as Dorothea Binz. This was one of the bloodiest Nazis. She found her true calling within this camp when she began to take charge of the tortures in the punishment bunker. The sadistic German enjoyed tormenting any inmate who was caught disobeying the rules, even if it was the aforementioned meetings with other prisoners to talk about politics. No matter what the offense was, training had taught this guard to be relentless. She now knew how to inflict pain on her victims and often beat them to death. On one occasion, she saw an exhausted prisoner fall to the ground. She approached, slapped her, and then took an axe to dismember her. After killing her, she noticed that her boot had been stained with blood, so she bent down to cut a piece of the deceased's dress and clean them. This was one type of violence that women experienced in Ravensbrück, but it was not the only one. Male guards were also lethal and often added rape to this, forcing inmates into prostitution. As a result of sexual relations, many prisoners became pregnant and had children who were confined to the same cruel fate.
The Nazis, according to their whim, would sometimes pluck a child from one block or another, and that child would never be seen again. Every evening when she returned from work, Mama anxiously wondered, "Will I find my little children waiting for me?"
Children were particularly vulnerable during the Holocaust. The Nazis justified their murder as part of the racial struggle, or as a preventive security measure, saying that they would be a danger to the Third Reich in the future. In this way, the Germans and their collaborators killed children for these ideological reasons, and often also in retaliation for attacks by their parents. Approximately 1.5 million children were executed during the Second World War, a number that includes Jews, Roma or Gypsies, German children with physical and mental disabilities, Poles, and those living in the occupied Soviet Union. This was one of the cruelest aspects that the prisoners of Ravensbrück could see with their own eyes, and the survivors made this clear when they recalled it.
I entered this room and was appalled to find newborns piled up on the beds where they were being kept. They looked like little old men. It was horrific.
That was one thing for which I could never forgive the Germans. The children in the camps, the things we saw.
The technique of starvation had already been tried by the Nazis. In Ravensbrück, it was applied to babies and their mothers.
Now, if slavery and torture weren't enough for you, Ravensbrück also received transports bound for the gas chambers. The train arrived packed with Jewish people who were sent to this place for extermination. They were locked in a room, and a powerful cyanide-based pesticide was thrown on them that killed them in a short time. This was not something exclusive to this concentration camp, but it added to the brutality that women suffered in its facilities, as was the case with the gruesome medical experiments. One of the most notorious involved the SS surgeon, Karl Gebhardt. In 1942, he was sent to Prague at Himmler's request since one of the Führer's most trusted men was seriously ill. He was one of the high-ranking Nazis, Reinhard Heydrich, whose life the medical professional was supposed to save. Despite the recommendations to use a particular treatment for the convalescent commander's infections, Gebhardt ignored it and looked for another way, but his efforts were in vain. Heydrich died and Hitler became furious. The tense atmosphere that followed this experience made the SS surgeon want to demonstrate that the option he had rejected was not going to work. So he decided to use the prisoners of Ravensbrück as an example. To do this, he made cuts in the victims and placed earth or glass on them to generate large infections that would then be subjected to the effect of the drugs.
To preserve his reputation, Gebhardt set out to demonstrate the ineffectiveness of sulfonamide, a forerunner of antibiotics, on gangrene. And Ravensbrück would be the arena of his medical experiments. These were carried out in the Revier, the infirmary block, a double building covering 1,500 square meters, connected by a corridor comprising 20 rooms, including 7 wards for the hospitalization of inmates, an operating theater, an examination room, and offices.
Gebhardt was not alone in this space. He was joined by Herta Oberhäuser, a Nazi nurse who enjoyed removing and reimplanting body parts from children and women to check their degree of recovery with the use of the same treatments. Her sadism reached such a point that most of them died in the operating room, and those who survived suffered serious after effects for the rest of their lives. Another of the tests in which she participated aimed to break part of the limbs of these guinea pigs to check how the nerve muscle regeneration occurred, or if a transplant was necessary. Previously, they hit them with a hammer or a chisel, then they sewed the affected parts, and, after a reasonable time, they reopened the wounds to check the results. This is how the infirmary block became the terror of the prisoners.
They took me into the operating theater in a wheelchair. I had no idea why I was being taken there. They injected us with a liquid. We were laid down, completely drowsy. We didn't know what was going to happen to us. We were in good health.
The experimentation seemed to have no limits, and the little ones were not excluded either. Children were injected with oil to extract their vital organs and bones while they were still alive. An extremely painful process that led to death in less than 5 minutes. Those who survived the cruel technique were still killed by Oberhäuser, who injected them with gasoline in the arm. Thus, whatever the age of the prisoner who passed through the hands of these two infamous characters, the result ended up being the same: a brutal and merciless death.
I was that scared to go to the doctor, because if you were going to be sent to the Revier, that they might inject you, and that's how people died.
After learning about all these atrocities, we are left with the final destination of Ravensbrück, which was the main supplier of women to the brothels established in many major Nazi camps towards the end of the war. While it was not unusual for female prisoners to be raped by guards in these places, brothels also existed as a method of control and reward for male detainees, and especially for homosexuals, as they were forced to have relations with someone of the female sex, believing that this would cure them of what the Germans understood as a deviation. Often the victims of these practices volunteered for these positions in the hope of avoiding the harder physical labor and perhaps receiving better food rations, but most died quickly due to sexual abuse and the rampant spread of venereal diseases. With the fall of Adolf Hitler and Nazism, perhaps they thought these treatments would end, But the survivors of Ravensbrück who were liberated by Red Army forces were also victims of Soviet war crimes, as they were raped by their supposed saviors. So we are coming to the end, and we can say that this concentration camp probably did not have the same impact as others like Auschwitz, but that does not mean that it was not just as bloody for its occupants. Throughout World War II, between 5,000 and 6,000 women died in the gas chamber built in the camp. In addition, it is estimated that another 50,000 died from cold, hunger, shootings, beatings, lethal injections, and various diseases. Ravensbrück may not have been etched into the Western visual imagination either, since unlike the liberation of other camps, it was not filmed or documented with iconic photographs. In fact, it doesn't quite fit into the history of the Holocaust either, as it was mostly the destination of political prisoners. However, it has left stories of pain and suffering, as indelible marks on tens of thousands of lives that suffered Nazi brutality there. Now, after having learned everything about the only concentration camp exclusively for women in the Third Reich, it is time to say goodbye. But first, we would like to know what you think. Which do you think is the most brutal camp created by the Germans? Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We hope to meet you again in our next video.